Hello everyone, welcome back to our group presentation. Today, our group will explain about hypothesis in quantitative research. Our group consists of three members. They are Mutia Hamida, Mevi Yulianti, and Nova Pandansari. Well, let's get the ball rolling.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. In this occasion, our group will be explain our topic about hypothesis in quantitative research. So I am Nova Pandansari and I will be the first speaker. Okay, I will start from defining the four terms used in research such as purpose statement, research question, research hypothesis, and research objective. So from the figure 4.1, we can see that those forms differ in kind of intent, form, use, and placement in research reports. So I will explain them one by one. So in purpose statement, the intent of purpose statement is to advance overall direction or focus for the study. And for form, in purpose statement is usually written in one or more sentences. And then purpose statement is used both in quantitative and qualitative research. And the last one is purpose statements is usually found at the end of introduction or in statement of problem. Okay, the second one is research question. So the intent of research question is to narrow the purpose statement to specific question that researchers seek to answer. And for the form, research question usually written in one or more question, and then it can be used both in quantitative and qualitative research. In quantitative research, question relate attribute to individuals or organizations. In qualitative, question include the central concept that being explored. And for placement, the research question usually located at the end of introduction or after literature. And the third one is hypothesis. So the intent of hypothesis is to make prediction about the outcome of a relationship among attributes or characteristics. For the form, hypothesis is usually written in one or more statement and only used for quantitative research because hypothesis is used for someone who want to conduct experiment studies. And for placement, hypothesis usually state at the beginning of study, typically at the end of introduction. And the last is research objective. So the intent of research objective is to specify goals that the investigators plan to achieve in a study. And the form of research objective is usually written in one or more objective and used both in quantitative and qualitative research and often subdivided into major and minor objective. And the last one is placement is also stated at the beginning of study, typically at the end of the introduction. Okay, we move to the next slide about the example of each term. For the first is the example of purpose statement. So in here, I have quantitative version and qualitative version. In quantitative, for example, the purpose of this study is to examine the relationship between use of internet communication between teachers and parents. And the second one, in qualitative version, the purpose of this study is to explore parent stories regarding internet communication with teachers about their student in one Midwestern school district. Okay, the second example is about research question. So, in quantitative version, do parent-teachers internet communication affect student performance in the classroom? And the second one is qualitative version. What types of internet experiences do parents have with teachers about the performance of the parents' children? Okay, let's move to the next example about hypothesis in quantitative research. So, in here, the example is student in high school in the school district in which parents and teachers communicate through the internet will have the higher grade than students whose parents and teachers do not communicate through the internet. And then the last example is the objective of the research. So there are three objectives of the research in this slide. The first is to describe the frequency of internet communication. The second one is to describe the types of internet communication, and the third one is to relate frequency and types of communication. As we can see from the slide, the objective of the research usually is subdivided into major and minor objectives, so they are arranged from the general to the specific one. Okay, we move to the next part about why are the statement and question important. So very first, the statements are signposts. It means that without clear signposts, the reader will be lost throughout your study. And the second one is help the researcher to identify the most appropriate methods for collecting the data. And the third is provide key components for understanding the result of a project. So to write good purpose statement and research question, we can begin with some concept that you need to know and establish the building blocks for writing the statement and question into a study. Okay, we move to the next part about how do you design quantitative purpose statement, research question, and hypothesis. So to write quantitative purpose statement, research question, and hypothesis, you need to understand the importance and the use of variables. Okay, the first variables is specified variables. Specified variables is characteristic or attribute of an individual that researcher can measure or observe and varies among individuals or organizations studied variables typically. So I will explain the bold text one by one. So characteristic of individuals refers to the personal aspect about them, such as their rate level, age, and income level, while attribute on individual represent about how an individual in an organization feel, behave, or thinking. And measure refers to the researcher record information from individual in one of two ways, such as asking them to answer question and on a questionnaire, and observing an individual and record score on a log or checklist. Okay, we move to the second variable. It is about family variable. So this family is shown in figure 4.3. So from the figure 4.3, we see that there are independent variable, intervening variables, and the last one dependent variables. Independent variables is characteristic that influence or affect an outcome or dependent variable, while dependent is an attribute or characteristic that is dependent on or influenced by the independent variables. For the example, there is a research question such as, do students who spend more instructional time in class on math have higher math scores than students who spend less time? So in here, the independent variable is time on math instruction, while the dependent variable is math scores. So in this figure, we also found the intervening variable. So intervening variable is an attribute or characteristic that stands between the independent and dependent variable and exercises an influence on the dependent variable apart from the independent variables. Okay. In the figure, we also found the confounding variable. It is contribute or characteristic that the researcher cannot directly measure because their effect cannot be easily separated from those of their variable, even though they may influence the relation between the independent and dependent variables. Okay, we move to the next part. It is about the intervening variables stand between dependent and dependent variables. So from the figure 4.4, the first step is we decide independent variables. In here, the example is convenient office hours for students. And then after we create independent variable, we can move to dependent variable. So dependent variable is a student seeks help for faculty. And then after we create dependent variable, we move to the step 2 and we meet intervening variable. So when we create independent variables and then we can get intervening variable. For the example, the independent variable is convenient office hour for student, and then the intervening variable is student becomes willing to take risk. After intervening variables, we can get the step 3. In here we can get the complete variables, independent variables, intervening variables, and dependent variable. Independent variable become convenient office hours for student. Intervening variable, student becomes willing to take risk, and dependent variable is student seeks help from faculty. Okay, we move to the next slide. It is about think a lot about identifying variables. So in here there are 4 steps to think a lot about identifying variables. The first is you need to write from left to right the word independent, intervening, and dependent variable, like the figure 4.4 that I mentioned in previous slide. And the second one is start with dependent variables. And then the third one is identify the independent variables, and the last one is allocate any intervening variables that may be used by the authors. Okay, I think it is all from me. Thank you.
Hi everyone, let's go to the next slide about theories and testing of variables. Independent variable probably causes the dependent variable. The idea of probable causation is the researcher's attempt to establish a likely cause and effect relationship between variables, rather than prove the relationship. Here we can look the bridge between independent and dependent variables. From the independent variable to the dependent variable, there is a theory can be seen as a bridge explaining the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. And the next, we come to the types of explanations in the quantitative research. Here, we can see from extensive tasks by other researchers and broad abstractions. This is start from theory and then go down to conceptual framework and then go down to the theoretical rationale and go to explanation posed by the author as a hunch for why dependent variable related to the dependent variable. And the next, it's about how to write a quantitative purpose statement. This is a guidelines about how to write a quantitative purpose statement. The first, write a purpose statement in a single sentence. And the next, begin the statements with a key identifier words, such as the purpose of this study. And the next, introduce it in this statement by stating that you plan to test an theory. And the next, 3 options exist for using variable in this statement. For example, to describe, and then to indicate, and to compare. And the next, if variables are related of a groups compared, specify the independent and dependent variables, and any control or intervening variables. And the next, state the independent variable first or first positions in the sentence and followed by the dependent variable in the second positions in the sentence. And the last, identify the participants to be studied and the research site at which they will be studied. And the next, how to write the quantitative research questions. Here are guidelines How the basic steps in forming research questions. The first, pose a questions, and the next begin with how, what, and why. And the next, specify the independent, dependent, and mediating or control variables. And the next, use the words describe, compare, or relate to indicate directions or connections among the variables. And last, indicate the participants and the research stage for the study. Here we come to the three popular forms are available in quantitative research. The first, descriptive questions. Researchers use descriptive questions to identify participant responses to a single variable or questions. The questions can be, how frequently do African Americans feel isolated on college campuses? And the second form is relationship questions. Relationship questions seeks to answer the degree and magnitude of the relationship between two or more variables. The questions can be, how do feeling of isolation relate to or influence the ethnic identity of African Americans in United States? And the third form is comparison questions. Comparison questions to find out how two or more groups and a dependent variable differ in terms of one or more outcome variables. Experiments employ comparison questions. The questions can be, how do African Americans and Euro Americans compare in the perceptions of ethnic identity? And we come to the how to write a quantitative hypothesis. This is guidelines for write them. The first, state the variables in this order. Independent in the first positions, dependent second position, and the control third positions. If you compare groups in your hypothesis, explicitly states that groups. If variables are related, specify the relationship between the variable. And the next, make a predictions about the changes you expect in your groups, such as less or more favorable or no changes. And the next, you may set information about the participants and the size of the study, but this information may not be necessary if it repeats information stated in your proposed statement. And finally, we come to null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the most traditional form of writing a hypothesis. Null hypothesis make predictions that of all possible people whom researchers might study, called by general populations. Here we have example. If there is a difference between independent variable group 1 and independent variable group 2 in terms of dependent variable for participants at the research. So the example of application the script might be, there is no difference between at a risk and not at risk. The risk. Students in terms of students' achievement on the math test scores for third grade students in a Midwest school district.
Okay, the next slide about the alternative hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis divided to first, directional and non-directional. If you want use directional alternative hypothesis, you as the researcher predict the direction of a change, a different or a relationship for variable in the total population of people. A researcher select a sample of people from a population and predict that the score will be high, better, or change in some way. This typical form for writing hypothesis is encouraged in the literature more than any other type of hypothesis. The second type, non-directional alternative hypothesis. The researcher predict a change, a difference, or a relationship for variable in population, but doesn't indicate whether the direction of this prediction will be positive or negative, or greater or less. The non-directional alternative is not as popular as the directional alternative because the researcher does not take a stand about the direction of the relationship of the variable. After divided alternative hypothesis, we use alternative hypothesis, directional alternative hypothesis, and non-directional hypothesis. For example, the illustration, the student who participate in direct learning in for elementary school will have higher achievement score than students who participate whole language learning. You must divide it independent variable, learning direct and whole language, and dependent variable, achievement test score participant, third grade student. Research site for elementary school. Key indicator directional prediction is employed. Now we explain non-directional alternative hypothesis. For example, we have an illustration of this script would be: there is a difference between varsity athletes in high school who smoke and those who don't smoke in the time of athlete accomplishment. In this example, the author does not state whether the difference will be positive or negative. An analysis of the variable in this statement show independent variable, use of tobacco, smoker or non-smoker. Dependent variable, athlete accomplishment, participant, varsity athlete, site, high school. Key indicator, the word different, but the direction not specified. Okay, after you know kind alternative hypothesis and example, the next slide, how do you design qualitative purpose statement and research question? Everybody know difference between quantitative and qualitative. You can read the slide. The next, the central phenomena qualitative research. You look the picture or figure. This figure expresses difference between explaining and predicted variable in quantitative research and exploring a central phenomena in qualitative research. The next, emergency process in qualitative research. An emergency process indicates the intent or purpose of a study. The question asked by the researcher might change during the process of inquiry based on the feedback or response from participants. Question and purpose may change because the qualitative inquiry allows the participant to set direction in doing so. The researcher learns the participant's view rather than exposing his or her own view on the research situation. One question often asked if this means that you will be asking different questions of different people in your study. You know The next slide, writing qualitative purpose statement. You can read the guideline if you writing qualitative purpose statement. The next slide about the examining the foreign involvement and mother trust in participle studies. This line and better state to examine how the four physiological contracts influence foreign involvement decision across the three secondary grade level. We pose the following research question. What are the relative contribution of foreign rule contraction, self-efficacy, participation of teacher invitation, and participation of adolescent invitation to predict foreign involvement at home and at school in grade 7, 8, and 9. Okay, this is first session from our group. Thank you for attention, and let's say hamdalah together and word wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.